So this is 1 Peter chapter 2, the scripture for the 14th of July. Through the second chapter of 1 Peter, Peter invokes several Old Testament prophecies. Psalm 118 verse 22 was a favorite of Jesus, and the early church, for example, you can look at Acts 4 and look at the video for that, and we talked through this a little bit. The early church used it as well, and they really enjoyed using it. Peter takes this quote from Psalm 118:22 about the stone the builders rejected has become the head of the corner, has become the capstone. And then he surrounds it with two other references to stones found from the prophet Isaiah. And all of this is designed to make the point that we together, the body of believers, are built up together as God's temple. And Jesus, of course, is the primary foundation, but also the primary cornerstone, the primary capstone. The capstone is the little piece at the top of the arch that holds the entire arch together. You can just Google capstone and you'll see a picture of it. But that not only is Jesus, the cornerstone foundation, but also the capstone, but there are elements of wordplay here that extend all the way back to 2 Samuel 7, to the time of King David. So David, having been established on the throne at that time, decides, well, I've built myself a nice house, a nice palace. I want to build God a temple because God is still hanging out in this tent from our time in the wilderness. Shouldn't God get a nice house, is what he's thinking. And instead, after asking the prophet Nathan, hey, can I build God a temple? Nathan at first says, sure, yeah. But then Nathan goes and talks to God, and God says, actually, wait. Instead of you building me a house, let me make a promise to you, David, God says. I will build you a house. I will build you a house of descendants. And the throne will never leave your family. And in fact, one of your descendants, that person, that son, will be the one to build me a house. A son's going to come who shall build a house for God's name, is what God says to David. And while that prophecy had an immediate fulfillment in David's son Solomon, there was also a more general fulfillment in the time scale of eternity, where Jesus, as the son of David, builds a house builds a temple for God out of individual believers, individual churches. The Son Jesus and this house, the church, are therefore considered a royal priesthood and a holy nation because they're dedicated to God and therefore are holy priests. But they follow in the line of David and the line of kings and therefore are royal and our nation. They're a nation in and of themselves. So, because of all that, as Christians, we're called to a higher standard of behavior than the rest of the world. Others are going to see our identity as children of God. They're going to see our identity as stones making up the temple of God. And they're going to, by how they interact with us, they're going to judge God. And they're going to make an evaluation of God and of other believers based on how they see us. So that means we need to be above reproach with every action that we take. This is the theme that Peter explores for the rest of this chapter in discussing how the people of God must act toward authorities, whether civil authorities or personal authorities. So he takes up the matter of civil authorities first. And I wonder, how might we respond to a civil authority which harms citizens or which rebels against God's commands in some way? Well, we're first Christians before we're citizens. And so our allegiance must be first of all to Christ before our allegiance is to any city or country or any other idea. That means that there may exist laws that we cannot follow in good conscience. But I think there's a difference between Christians being inconvenienced by laws they don't really like and laws that are established against Christians. So as a minister, I, for example, could refuse to pay my Social Security. There's a form you could fill out that says, hey, I claim a religious exemption for this. But that would really be a matter of convenience for me, not a religious conviction, because Christ is very clear that we need to provide for the least of these. And that's part of what Social Security does. By not paying into that, I'm just conveniencing myself a little more. Then Peter offers some thoughts on slavery, and particularly in America, these thoughts don't really seem to have aged very well. Let me tackle these for a short amount of time before wrapping up. I think Peter's thoughts on slavery are very similar to other Greek moral commands of his time. And there's some truth to his guidance. I think this is how Christ conducted himself. Whether he was hated or loved, he was faithful to his God. And he didn't answer violence for violence, but answered it with love. But in the context of American slavery, where this text was used to subjugate and oppress, well, it's an entirely different ballgame. We cannot look at this text and tear it from its context and how it was used. And I think that we need to hold this text on the one hand, and on the other hand, hold the truth that by no means should any person ever, by means of the gospel, be allowed to be treated as objects for any reason by any other person. I wonder, how do you conduct yourself honorably among non-Christians? That's all for 1 Peter 2, and tomorrow, the 15th of July, we'll look at 1 Peter 3. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.